In the book of Exodus, the 10 plagues of Egypt are a series of dramatic events that transformed the course of history and marked the liberation of the Hebrew people from slavery. More than simple catastrophes, the plagues had a specific divine purpose: to reveal the power of God, challenge the Egyptian gods, and free his people so that they could worship him freely. The story invites us to reflect deeply on the justice, patience, and power of God, and demonstrates that, despite the apparent misfortunes, God was in control of every detail, revealing his faithfulness to his children. God called Moses to be the leader of this process, a role that he was initially reluctant to accept. Moses was aware that confronting Pharaoh and the oppressive Egyptian system was an immense task, but God instructed him, promising to be by his side. And throughout each plague, we can see that God not only challenges Pharaoh, but also reveals to each of us important lessons about God's power, judgment, and love. Let's understand together what each plague teaches us and how we can apply these principles in our daily lives. The plagues of Egypt occurred at a time when the Hebrew people had been enslaved for centuries, living under extreme oppression. After years of peace and prosperity during Joseph's time in Egypt, the Hebrew people grew in number, becoming a nation within a nation. The new Pharaoh, who did not know Joseph, Exodus 1 verse 8, began to see the growth of the Hebrews as a threat to his power and to the security of Egypt. In an attempt to control this increasingly numerous group, Pharaoh enslaved them, imposing heavy labor and suffering into their lives, and treating them with extreme cruelty. Exodus 1 verses 11 to 14. During this long period of slavery, the Hebrews cried out to God for deliverance, and God, in his compassion and faithfulness, heard the cry of his people and decided to intervene. In this context, the role of the plagues goes far beyond simply punishing Pharaoh and the Egyptians. The plagues are God's instruments to demonstrate his sovereignty, to directly confront the Egyptian gods, and to free his chosen people. Egypt was a center of polytheistic worship, where various gods were worshipped and considered protectors of different aspects of life. The Egyptians believed that their gods controlled the nature and prosperity of the nation. Pharaoh, considered divine by the Egyptians, was seen as the ultimate representation of power and authority on earth. He refused to acknowledge the God of Israel, as we see in Exodus 5 verse 2, when he asks, "Who is the Lord, that I should obey his voice and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, nor will I let Israel go." The plagues, therefore, had a clear purpose: to demonstrate that the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, was greater than Pharaoh and any Egyptian deity. In Exodus 7 verse 5, God declares that the plagues would make the Egyptians know that I am the Lord. Each of the 10 plagues directly challenged Egyptian beliefs, subverting the power of their gods, such as Hapi, god of the Nile, Hathor, goddess of fertility, and Ra, god of the sun. The plagues served as unmistakable signs of God's power, revealing his authority and his willingness to intervene in human history, especially on behalf of those who seek him. Through them, God not only led his people to freedom, but also made a powerful spiritual statement to the ancient world: that the true God is just, hears the cries of the oppressed, and acts to free them. The first plague that God sent to Egypt was the turning of the waters of the Nile River into blood. This event was much more than a natural disaster or an unusual phenomenon. It was a direct blow to the heart of Egypt and its deepest beliefs. The Nile was essential to the survival and prosperity of the Egyptian nation. On its fertile banks, the entire economy of Egypt depended on the waters of the river for irrigation, transportation, and drinking water. With this plague, God not only affected the daily lives of the Egyptians, but also confronted one of their most revered deities, Hapi, the god of the Nile, who was seen as responsible for the course and fertility of the river's waters. In Exodus 7 verses 17 to 18, God instructs Moses to tell Pharaoh, "This is what the Lord says. By this you will know that I am the Lord. I will strike the waters of the Nile with the rod in my hand, and they will turn to blood. The fish in the Nile will die, and the Nile will stink, and the Egyptians will loathe to drink the waters of the Nile. This announcement makes clear the purpose of this plague: to reveal God's power and to show Pharaoh that, despite his resistance and disbelief, he was standing before the one true Lord. When the waters of the Nile turned to blood, the impact was devastating. The red color invaded the river, killing the fish and spreading an unbearable odor. The biblical text describes how the Egyptians were forced to dig around the river to find drinking water because the main waters had become unfit for consumption. Exodus 7:24. This episode demonstrates the fragility of Egypt's material resources and its dependence on what God could instantly transform and render useless. By touching the Nile, God struck at the pride and security of a nation that saw itself as self-sufficient and powerful. From a spiritual perspective, this plague reveals that God is above natural forces and that he has control over all creation. The Egyptians' belief in Hapi as the guardian of the Nile was challenged and subverted by God's intervention. The plague was a visible sign to the Egyptians and the Hebrews that the Lord of Israel not only heard the cry of his people but also had the power to act on their behalf. Yet Pharaoh's heart remained hardened, and he refused to let the Hebrew people go. This hardening of Pharaoh's heart is central to this account, for it represents the struggle between human will and divine sovereignty. Even in the face of such a direct and powerful plague, Pharaoh resisted, reaffirming his refusal to acknowledge the power of the Hebrew God. He ordered his own magicians to imitate the miracle, and they were able to reproduce the appearance of blood with sorcery. Exodus 7 verse 22. However, the magicians could not reverse the plague or purify the waters of the Nile, proving that their power was limited compared to the power of the Lord. The first plague also carries important symbolism. The blood in the waters of the Nile anticipates the blood that will be shed in Egypt as a consequence of Pharaoh's sin and refusal to obey God. Thus, the plague of blood not only challenges the beliefs of the Egyptians, but also points to the seriousness of God's judgment. In other words, the turning of the Nile into blood was a form of warning. If Egypt continued to harden its heart, more consequences would follow. This episode of the first plague teaches us about God's sovereign authority and the importance of recognizing that he is the Lord of all creation. By touching the God that Egypt considered untouchable, God demonstrates that he is not only in control of nature, but also that he hears and acts on behalf of those who cry out for justice and liberation. The second plague sent by God to Egypt was an invasion of frogs that covered the entire land, creating chaos and discomfort in every home and workplace. Imagine the scene: frogs jumping on beds, getting into cooking pots, and disrupting the daily lives of the Egyptians. This plague is described in Exodus 8 verses 3-4, where God instructs Moses to tell Pharaoh that the Nile River would overflow with frogs, invading every part of the land. This spectacle was both irritating and disturbing, a true disruption of Egypt's peace. Frogs were worshipped in Egypt, and the people associated them with fertility and the cycle of life. The god Hecate, represented by a frog-headed figure, was seen as a symbol of birth and regeneration. Hecate was an especially important deity, as she was believed to assist women during childbirth and bring prosperity. Thus, the abundance of frogs might initially seem like an overwhelming blessing, but it soon became an uncontrollable and unbearable plague. God, by sending this plague, demonstrated that he could transform something that the Egyptians considered sacred and good into a source of torment, exposing Hecate's inability to contain or control the proliferation of frogs. Furthermore, this plague highlighted that God not only dominates the great phenomena of nature, such as turning the Nile into blood, but also exercises absolute control over the small creatures of the earth. In flooding Egypt with frogs, God did not use a ferocious animal or an overwhelming destructive force, but something small and seemingly harmless. This contrast is significant, for it shows that divine power does not depend on greatness. God is equally powerful in controlling the great and the tiny. When Pharaoh realized that he could not solve the frog problem, he finally sought out Moses and asked him to intercede so that the frogs would go away. Moses prayed, and the frogs began to die, piling up in heaps throughout Egypt, resulting in an unbearable stench. Exodus 8 verses 13 to 14. Even after this clear sign of God's power and his direct answer to Pharaoh's request, the king's heart remained hardened, and he refused to let the Hebrew people go. This second plague teaches us that God is sovereign and that everything, even the simplest creatures, obeys his command. God demonstrated that his dominion over creation is absolute, exposing the frailty of the Egyptian deities and revealing that true control over life and nature belongs to him alone. The plagues served as reminders that no matter how great the power and pride of Pharaoh in Egypt, no one could resist God's will when he decided to free his people. The third plague that God sent to Egypt was an infestation of lice that covered both people and animals, an irritating and overwhelming plague. In Exodus 8 verse 17, we read that when Aaron stretched out his staff and struck the dust of the ground, lice came out and spread throughout Egypt, infecting both people and animals. This seemingly simple event had a profound impact, as the lice multiplied uncontrollably, directly affecting the daily lives and well-being of the Egyptians. Pharaoh's magicians, who had been able to replicate the first two plagues with their sorcery, were unable to replicate this third plague. This marked a turning point, as the magicians' limitations were exposed, and they were forced to recognize that this plague was the work of God. In Exodus 8 verse 19, they tell Pharaoh, "This is the finger of God," admitting that the power they had witnessed was far beyond what any human magic could do. This statement shows that, in the face of divine power, even those who practiced the occult and sorcery recognized that they were dealing with an incomparable force. This plague was more than an invasion of tiny insects. It had a profound meaning for the Egyptians. In a culture where cleanliness and purity were highly valued, especially for the priests who served in the temples, the presence of lice made life unbearable. The Egyptians prided themselves on their clean appearance and their purification rituals. But this plague directly interfered with these aspects, causing discomfort and humiliation. God, by sending this plague, exposed the vulnerability of the Egyptians and demonstrated that even physical and ritual care could not protect them against his will. Furthermore, the plague of lice was not only proof of God's superiority over the Egyptian magicians, but also a declaration that no earthly or spiritual power could match the Lord. The limitation of the magicians showed that divine power is not only stronger than human magic, but completely incomparable and inaccessible. While previous plagues had confronted Egyptian gods such as Hapi and Heket, this plague showed that God did not need grand manifestations to prove his sovereignty. Even the tiniest creatures, such as lice, were under his command. The plague of lice reminds us that God is sovereign over every aspect of creation, from the greatest to the smallest, and that he can use even the simplest things to accomplish his purposes. By sending this plague, God revealed his authority and showed that when he decides to act, nothing can stop his plan. The fourth plague sent to Egypt was an infestation of flies, filling the houses and all public places to an unbearable extent. Exodus 8 verse 24 describes this terrifying scene, saying that swarms of flies came upon Pharaoh's house and upon the houses of his servants, and throughout all the land of Egypt the land was destroyed because of them. Imagine swarms of flies covering every surface, invading every corner of the country and making life a living nightmare for the Egyptian people. This time, God did something special and remarkable. He separated the Hebrew people, who lived in the land of Goshen, from the plague. In that place where the Hebrews lived, there were no flies. This detail was not accidental. It was a way for God to clearly and visibly show his protection and special care for his people. This act served to demonstrate both God's sovereignty and his love for the people of Israel. While the Egyptians suffered from the incessant presence of flies, the Hebrews were safe, untouched by this plague. This distinction was a powerful lesson for Pharaoh, who could see that the God of the Hebrews not only had the power to send plagues, but also to specifically protect those who were his. This plague had an even greater impact on Pharaoh's pride and the Egyptians, for it revealed that divine protection was not a distant or abstract power, but something present and visible. The fact that Goshen was free of flies was a constant testimony to God's favor over the people of Israel. The plague directly confronted the powerlessness of the Egyptian gods and Pharaoh's inability to protect his own people. He, the most powerful ruler in the region, could not rid his people of the flies, while the God of the Hebrew slaves kept them completely free from torment. By specifically protecting the land of Goshen, God reinforced to the Hebrew people that they were not forgotten. Even in the midst of oppression and suffering, they were kept and seen. This plague highlights God's faithfulness in fulfilling his promises to care for his people and shows that he is in control of every situation, able to provide deliverance in the midst of chaos. The fourth plague was a visible reminder that God's people are protected even when the world around them is in torment. God is able to separate and protect those who belong to him, demonstrating that each of his children is precious to him and worthy of his care. The plague of flies thus served as a sign of God's distinction and special favor toward Israel, revealing to Egypt that the Lord of the Hebrews was the true God, a God of power and mercy. In the fifth plague, God sent a devastating disease that struck the Egyptians' livestock and animals, causing great loss and suffering. This plague is described in Exodus 9 verses 3-6, where God warned Pharaoh that a severe plague would strike all the Egyptians' livestock in the fields, including horses, donkeys, camels, oxen, and sheep. In contrast, the Hebrews' livestock, once again, remained untouched. This was not only a sign of God's protection over Israel, but also a powerful message to Egypt. The Egyptians deeply valued livestock and animals, which were seen as symbols of strength, wealth, and prosperity. Several Egyptian deities were associated with animals. Hathor, for example, was depicted as a cow and worshipped as the goddess of fertility and prosperity. The death of the livestock, therefore, was a blow that shook the religious and cultural structures of Egypt, showing that not even their gods could protect that which symbolized security and stability. God was thus revealing his supremacy, making it clear that he had absolute control over the lives of all creatures. This plague was particularly significant because it struck at Egypt's livelihood. Livestock were an essential source of food, work, and trade. The sudden loss of these animals had profound economic consequences, shaking the stability of the country. God was showing that all the strength and power the Egyptians believed they had could not protect them from his hand. It was a direct message to Pharaoh and the people. Their self-sufficiency and worship of gods would not provide them with security in the face of the Lord's power. Furthermore, the distinction between the Egyptians and the Hebrews became clear again. The fact that the Hebrews' livestock were not affected showed that God not only had the power to send the plague, but also to restrain it and protect those who belonged to him. In Exodus 9 verse 4, God says that he will make a distinction between the livestock of Israel and the livestock of Egypt, so that nothing belonging to the children of Israel will die. This special protection emphasized that the God of Israel was a personal God, attentive to the suffering of his people and determined to fulfill his promise of deliverance. The fifth plague thus taught an important lesson. God has complete authority over life and death, and no force or deity can rival him. In addition to being a sign of judgment against the oppression and idolatry of Egypt, this plague showed the Hebrews that the God they were about to follow in the wilderness was a faithful, powerful, and protective God. At the same time, for the Egyptians, it was stark evidence that their security and prosperity, symbolized by their livestock, were in the hands of the Lord, and not under the control of their beliefs or their gods. In the sixth plague, God sent a direct affliction to the Egyptians' bodies. Painful boils and sores covered people and animals, a physical plague that brought great suffering and once again exposed the powerlessness of the Egyptian deities. In Exodus 9 verses 9-11, God instructs Moses to take ashes from a furnace and throw them into the sky before Pharaoh. The ashes turned into a fine powder that, as it spread through the air, caused painful sores to form on the bodies of the Egyptians and their animals. Even Pharaoh's magicians were struck down and could not stand before Moses, forcing them to acknowledge the power of the God of Israel. This event was more than just a disease. The Egyptians had a belief system that included rigorous religious practices of purity and health, especially among the priests. Gods such as Sekhmet and Isis, associated with healing and protection, were widely venerated. The plague of boils, then, directly challenged this belief in protection and healing, demonstrating that no Egyptian power could prevent God's judgment. The personal suffering that the Egyptians faced from this plague was significant. Unlike previous plagues which had impacted their livelihood and comfort, the boils physically attacked each individual, affecting their body and well-being. It was an affliction that they could not ignore or avoid. The sores showed that in the face of God's power, control over their own health and physical integrity was beyond the reach of the Egyptians and even their magicians. In Exodus 9 verse 11, the magicians who had previously attempted to replicate Moses' miracles are described as unable to stand in his presence because of their sores, a scene that emphasizes human inability in the face of divine intervention. The plague also had profound symbolism. By affecting the priestly class, God was declaring that no one, not even the highest religious leaders of Egypt, was immune from his judgment. Even the spiritual leaders of Egypt, who were responsible for mediating the blessings of the gods, were touched by the plague. In this way, God not only exposed the failure of the Egyptian religious systems, but also weakened the authority of the priests, who were highly respected and considered mediators between the people and the gods. Their inability to protect themselves or others demonstrated that the God of Israel was superior to all the forces and sacred figures of Egypt. The sixth plague reinforced the lesson that God's power was absolute, not limited to a place or a social class. God struck directly at the source of the Egyptians' pride and confidence, showing that even the human body, a symbol of strength and personal mastery, was under his control. This plague was a clear demonstration that, in confronting God's authority, the people of Egypt and their leadership were condemned to recognize that only the Lord has absolute power over creation and over every human being. In the seventh plague, God sent an unprecedented hailstorm to Egypt, with thunder and lightning that devastated everything in the open air. In Exodus 9 verses 23 to 25, we see that when Moses raised his staff, he invoked God's wrath, and a hailstorm fell with extraordinary intensity, destroying crops, animals, and people who had not sought shelter. It was a plague that shook both the economic security and religious confidence of the Egyptians, as it exposed Egypt's vulnerability to natural forces under the control of the God of Israel. This plague also had profound spiritual symbolism. The Egyptians worshipped several gods associated with nature and the weather, including Nut, the goddess of the sky, and Osiris, the god of vegetation and agriculture. By causing such widespread destruction through a weather event, God challenged the belief that these gods could protect Egypt and ensure its agricultural prosperity. He demonstrated that he was the Lord of the weather and the seasons, showing with power that nature itself obeyed his word, and that with a simple command he could dismantle Egypt's security and livelihood. This hail destroyed the flax and barley crops, which were essential to the Egyptian economy, directly affecting the people's livelihood and causing an economic crisis. With flax, Egypt produced fabrics, and barley was used both for food and for the production of beer, an important item in Egyptian culture. With the devastation of these crops, the country faced not only a supply crisis, but also a disruption of its daily and religious activities, since many of the Egyptian rituals and ceremonies used agricultural products. In addition, the plague of hail was an example of God's justice and mercy. In Exodus 9 verses 19 to 21, God warned the Egyptians through Moses, instructing them to protect their animals and servants from the hail. Those who obeyed were spared, while those who ignored the warning suffered loss. This distinction shows that God offered an opportunity for protection, highlighting that his purpose was not only to cause destruction, but also to give the Egyptians a chance to recognize his authority and respond with humility. This plague revealed that even the most uncontrollable and powerful forces of nature were under God's command. The event was a reminder that the Lord is the creator and sustainer of all things, and that neither the weather nor the fertility of the earth are in the hands of man or pagan gods. The hailstorm was a call to Egypt to recognize that only the God of Israel had absolute power over the natural world, and that it was he who truly controlled creation and life. In the 8th plague, God sent swarms of locusts to invade Egypt, devouring whatever crops had survived the hail. In Exodus 10 verses 12 to 15, God commands Moses to stretch out his hand over Egypt, and an east wind brings a swarm of locusts so thick that it covers the land and darkens the sky. They devour everything: plants, trees, fruits, and any green vegetation that remained after the previous plagues. This devastation completed Egypt's agricultural collapse, leaving the population in deep crisis and despair. Agriculture was the heart of the Egyptian economy, and their civilization depended on the fertility of the Nile soil to sustain its abundance and prosperity. The arrival of the locusts was a final blow to the people's food security, completely compromising their sources of livelihood and symbolizing the ruin of what they believed to be unshakable. With this plague, God not only destroyed what remained of the crops, but also exposed the fragility of Egypt's prosperity, showing that all material security was empty without him. The prosperity that Egypt proudly attributed to its gods and the Nile River itself was revealed to be fragile and powerless before the power of God. Furthermore, this plague challenged Egypt's spiritual pride. The Egyptians worshipped gods such as Osiris, the god of fertility and agriculture, and Set, who was associated with the protection of the crops. The invasion of the locusts proved the impotence of these gods and showed that no Egyptian spiritual power was capable of preventing or controlling God's judgment. Once again, the Lord directly challenged Egypt's religious system, demonstrating that he alone had authority over nature and human subsistence. The locusts were a visible sign of God's destructive power over everything the Egyptians took for granted. In Exodus 10 verse 7, we see Pharaoh's own officials begging him to free the Hebrews, for they recognized that Egypt was in ruins. This plea shows that even Pharaoh's advisors were beginning to understand that the God of Israel was not like the Egyptian gods. He was real and his power was irresistible. Despite this, Pharaoh's heart remained hardened, revealing the human stubbornness in resisting repentance, even in the face of such clear signs of divine judgment. The 8th plague, then, was a lesson to Egypt and to all who witnessed these events, demonstrating that all human prosperity, security, and power are fragile when compared to the sovereign power of God. The invasion of the locusts was a reminder that the riches of the earth do not belong to man, but are gifts from God, and that he has the power to give and take away as he pleases. Egypt's prosperity, built on pride and trust in false gods, was destroyed to show that true security and provision come only from God, the Lord of all creation. The 9th plague, which brought thick darkness over Egypt for 3 days, is one of the most dramatic and symbolic of God's judgments. In Exodus 10 verses 21 to 23, the Lord commands Moses to stretch out his hand toward the sky, and immediately a deep darkness descends over the land of Egypt, a darkness that could be felt. The intensity of this plague was so severe that people could not move, and there was no light anywhere in Egypt. The only exception was the land of Goshen, where the Hebrews lived, which remained illuminated. This darkness had a profound meaning. The Egyptians worshipped Ra, the sun god, who was considered one of the most powerful deities in the Egyptian pantheon. By covering Egypt with darkness, God was not only attacking the worship of Ra, but also affirming that he was the true Lord of the universe, superior to any god Egypt could invoke. The Egyptian people, who depended on sunlight for their agriculture and daily life, found their security and livelihood threatened by total darkness. Darkness also represents a spiritual state of separation from God. In the Bible, darkness often symbolizes sin, death, and separation from God's light. This plague served as a powerful wake-up call. As the Egyptians gave themselves over to idolatry and oppression, they were confronted with the reality that they were living in darkness, both physically and spiritually. This situation highlights God's sovereignty and his ability to illuminate the lives of those who belong to him, while those who reject him are lost in the shadows. God, in his mercy, also provided a space for the Egyptians to recognize the greatness of his power. The darkness was not only a punishment, but an opportunity for reflection and repentance. During these 3 days, the Egyptians could have sought the true light that can only come from the God of Israel. However, Pharaoh's hardened heart prevented this from happening. Their refusal to free the Hebrews demonstrated their persistence in unbelief and resistance to God, even in the face of such impressive miracles. The light that remained in the land of Goshen, where the Hebrews lived, symbolized God's protection and presence with his people. This distinction between light and darkness was not just a physical matter, but a representation of God's relationship with those who worship and follow him. Light is often seen in the Bible as a symbol of divine revelation and truth, while darkness represents confusion and alienation. The 9th plague, therefore, not only demonstrated God's authority over the forces of nature, but it also directly confronted the spiritual heart of Egypt. It was a powerful reminder that true light and life come from the Lord, while darkness symbolized the separation and spiritual death that result from idolatry and disobedience. This plague teaches us that even in times of darkness and despair, those who are with God can experience his light and presence, even when everything around them seems dark and hopeless. The 10th plague, which resulted in the death of the firstborn of Egypt, was one of the most dramatic and significant events in the history of the Hebrew people. In Exodus 11 verses 4-5, God instructs Moses to tell Pharaoh that at midnight he would pass through Egypt and strike down all the firstborn, from Pharaoh's sons to the firstborn of the animals. This plague was not only a divine judgment, but also a call to reflection on the oppression of the people of Israel. To protect the Hebrews, God gave clear instructions. Each family was to sacrifice an unblemished lamb and mark their doors with the animal's blood. This marking was a signal to the angel of death, who would pass over the houses where the blood was, sparing the Hebrew firstborn from death. This practice would become a central symbol in Jewish tradition, establishing Pesach, or Passover, as a celebration of divine deliverance and protection. The symbolism of this plague is profound. The sacrificed lamb represents not only the physical salvation of the Hebrews, but also a theological principle that points to the sacrifice of Christ, the Lamb of God, who would take away the sin of the world, John 1 verse 29. Just as the blood of the Lamb protected the Hebrews from death, the blood of Christ protects us from spiritual death and eternal judgment. The death of the firstborn was a devastating event for Egypt, which culminated in the liberation of the Hebrews from slavery. This tragedy not only shook the family structures, but also wounded the heart of Pharaoh, who finally gave in to God's demands. The pain of loss caused him to recognize God's authority and the urgency of the Hebrew people's deliverance. This plague also had broader implications. Egypt, which had oppressed Israel, now faced the severity of divine judgment. The death of the firstborn was an act of justice that not only reaffirmed God's power but also served as a warning to all nations about the consequences of opposing the Lord. The narrative of the 10th plague is a powerful reminder of the cost of disobedience and the importance of sacrifice in the quest for redemption. Just as the Hebrews were instructed to protect themselves by the blood of the Lamb, we are invited to seek protection and redemption in the sacrifice of Christ. The central message is that salvation comes through faith and obedience to God, who in his mercy always provides a way to salvation. Furthermore, this plague opened a new chapter in the history of the people of Israel. From this point on, they would no longer be known simply as slaves in Egypt, but as God's chosen people, rescued and redeemed for a greater purpose. The 10th plague, therefore, not only represents a culmination in the liberation of the Hebrews, but also lays the foundation for the history of salvation, culminating in Christ. This story continues to be a powerful testimony to God's faithfulness and his unwavering love for his people. The plagues were not just punishments, but also acts of revelation and redemption. God wanted to free his people and show that he is the true God. In the end, Pharaoh was forced to free the Hebrews, and thus began the journey to the Promised Land. These plagues remind us that God is just and that he always acts for the good of his people, even in the most difficult times. The 10 plagues of Egypt were not just demonstrations of power. They reveal God's love for justice and his desire to free his people from slavery. Each plague, with its purpose and symbolism, invites us to trust in God's power and recognize that He is in absolute control.